Welcome to Philosophy for Living. This is a course that I've designed which brings together the ideas and wisdom of the great philosophers with the findings of modern psychology. And I've put them together in such a way to provide a course that I think will have its goal really to help you to have a deeper understanding of both fields, psychology and philosophy, but in a way that actually applies to yourself personally. A lot of the information that I will be going through in this course will be something that you can take and look at in terms of deepening your own understanding of yourself, of how you've become who you are, your identity, but also how you view the world and what's driving you, what ideas, what beliefs, and how you develop those beliefs. And not only that, but also how you engage with the world. And this includes your relationships with other people, how you understand how other people develop, and how culture affects that. So there's going to be a lot in this. So you're going to have very formal education in these areas without necessarily have to go and do a formal course. So it's to kind of combine these great sort of fonts of knowledge and information and learning in such a way that it's easy to digest. So the course will allow you to do certain things. You can take the course itself on its own merits and just look at it, listen to it, and apply it. Or you can decide to follow through some of the information I'm giving, because for each lecture that I give, I'm going to provide resources that you can go in at a deeper level and you can follow through some of the references that I give you. So in some ways, it's a little bit like a bit of a shortcut, because I would be able to identify and indicate where to go to find the information you need, rather than you having to go through tomes, and I'll do that heavy lifting for you. So when we look at these two fields of study, we think, okay, what is philosophy? What is psychology? Well, the best way to look at that is the root of the word philosophy. Philosophy is made of two parts, that word, one relation to in the Greek phileo and the other sophia, which is the love of wisdom. So essentially philosophy as a subject or as an area of knowledge can be best described as the love of wisdom. Psychology, which is a much newer field of study, is the science of human behavior, but it's based on the words psyche and logos. Psyche being for the soul and logos being for knowledge. So psychology is about the knowledge of the soul. So when we bring these two amazing sources of information and all of the ideas and all of the richness and depth of human thinking that have gone into these areas, we have these two amazing pieces that we're going to put together in this course: the love of wisdom and the knowledge of the soul. The course will be divided up into a number of lectures, and each is going to take a particular topic that's very, very important and crucial to what I believe is important in terms of living a life that is rich and in depth and wisdom and fulfillment. And in doing that, I'm going to be quite critical of some of the information that's out there in the self-help world. So along the way, as we are going through this adventure together, you will find that I will actually maybe be critical of certain things that are out there, certain ideologies, certain beliefs. I mean, one, for example, that has essentially sort of now become almost like thematic in the self-help world or the self-help genre. And you'll see it in workshops and seminars and books, is the role of belief. The best way that I can talk about that is if you ever go to Disneyland. I've been to Disneyland several times and it's great escapist. I know some people get annoyed about that because I think it's just commodified everything and it's corporatized everything, and it's taken all the wonderful things like the real depth of what fairy tales mean and it's just made them into candy floss. But anyway, that aside, I enjoy the escapism of it. But at some point along the way, you will actually encounter Mickey Mouse. And it'll be either one of the stage presentations or maybe the meet and greet. And as you do that, you will also come across something that you will hear, which is this ideological position, which is, in order to make your dreams come true, all you need to do is to believe. Now, I need to tell you something. That's not true. And it's kind of in the whole self-help genre. Everywhere you go, I hear people, now it's okay for Mickey Mouse. Maybe it works for him, but actually it isn't true for human beings. Belief is important, but it's only one strand in a very complex cable. So we just have to lay that to one side. To make your dreams come true requires an awful lot more than that. And hopefully, through our encounter with philosophy and psychology here, you will actually have a better grasp of what that might mean for you. Now, there'll be certain things that I'll be doing which are kind of broad strokes, and the reason they're broad strokes is they kind of have to fit most of the picture of the human story. But every human being is unique, so you've got to take pieces that apply them to your own unique situation, and then leave things out that don't fit for you. So this session that we're going to do today is basically going to be on the issue of awareness. Now, why did I start with awareness? I started with awareness because essentially awareness is your first staging post. Awareness is about developing an insight into your life and into yourself. I mean, there's an old sort of saying, which is that if you don't know where you're going, then, any road will get you there, which I think is worth thinking about. So self-awareness means being able to have an understanding of where you're going, understanding of who you are, a deeper sensitivity about the person that you are. And how we cultivate this is our first, because this stays with you through all of the other aspects of the course as we go along. Now, where am I going to go with awareness? Well, I'm going to go back to the Greek philosophers for our understanding of awareness. And then I'm going to come back up to the more modern world. So I will be looking at Plato and Socrates, actually the other way around, Socrates before Plato. And then we will go to Martin Heidegger and a couple of others. And what we will do is we will look at some of the things they're saying to us about awareness, about understanding who we are in the world. Now, I was very attracted to the figure of Socrates when I first encountered him in my reading. And the reason why was because he had a certain way of actually sort of disputing with the people who felt that they knew it all. The rule makers, the people who actually were carrying on in the world as if they really understood what was going on. And his task was to show them that a lot of them had never really thought through what they believed. And I have that in me as well, as kind of slightly anti-authoritarian streak in me anyway, which I was attracted to. But also the realization that oftentimes we're following beliefs and ideas about life that we've picked up from somewhere, and we don't really actually examine what they are, and we don't necessarily know more clearly where we got them and whether they really serve us. So Socrates is a very useful philosopher from that point of view. He was born in 469 BC, so almost 500 years before Christ, but also had similarities in his experiences, which is that he challenged the great and the good of the time. And of course, he was obviously that caused a lot of problems for people, because when he would meet people in authority, he would ask them, well, what do you mean by justice? And he'd point out inconsistencies. And that is one of the figures of Christ, would be that he would also point out the hypocrisies of people, and particularly the Pharisees. If you're familiar with the New Testament, you would know that he would call them like whited sepulchres, all white on the outside and rotten on the inside. But Socrates challenged the beliefs of his community at that time, and he got in trouble for that, as we will see what happened. And he was brought before the court in Athens, and he had to defend himself. And during that defense, he made a sentence or a phrase that has stayed with me, and that is, he claims that to quote, the examined life is not worth living. So Socrates is telling us that it's a very important principle that to examine our lives. And I suspect that if you're looking at this and listening to this course, you want to examine your life. And oftentimes the reason why we examine our lives is because of something that calls to us. It could be an emotional pain, it could be an experience that we cannot integrate, and it says you need to have a better look at what's going on. And Socrates saw this as important because he called himself a gadfly. A gadfly is a particular stinging insect, And he described himself as a gadfly who was going to sting the great horse of the Athenian state, the first democracy, Athens. But complacency was rampant, and he wanted to sting people into waking up. And if you look at this idea of the examined life and awareness as a form of waking up, then a useful resource would be Anthony de Mello's book, Awareness, which is a lovely book and an easy read. But he says, wake up, wake up, wake up. And in that way, he's actually echoing Socrates. And of course, Socrates was brought before the court of Athens. He defended himself in the what is now the text called the Apology, which is worth a read, and I'll reference that for you. But he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death, and he died, and by drinking hemlock. So that was his punishment. But he could have avoided the death sentence had he wanted to. But he was a very courageous man who stood firm on his beliefs. So the next person we need to look at who followed Socrates is his student Plato. So if we have the Socratic principle is that the unexamined life is not worth living, then we have Plato who comes along and adds a lot of meat to the bones of that. And he describes a situation to us. He uses an allegory. Again, we know that Jesus used a lot of parables. Well, if we go back a bit further, we'll find that in Plato, one of the famous allegories, which is really about the issue of awareness and who we are and how we become who we are and how we know what we know. One of the famous allegories is called the allegory of the cave. And this is found in the book The Republic, which is a book that Plato wrote in terms of what he considered to be the makings of the just society, how a just society can be formed. But Plato was deeply affected by the death of Socrates, because Socrates was his mentor and his teacher. And we find in the allegory of the cave an explanation about awareness. And we're going to use that as our basic source for the rest of this lecture. So it's important when we go through this allegory that you try to imagine that it applies to you. So Plato is using Socrates as a mouthpiece here, even though Plato is dead at this, or Socrates is dead at this point. But one of the techniques they used back then a lot was the form of a conversation, a dialogue. And this is a dialogue between Glaucon and Socrates. And Socrates is the mouthpiece for Plato, and he is using him in the conversation. So it's a conversation, but you try and imagine that you're in that conversation. You think about what the people are saying in it. So we'll start. So this is the opening piece of the allegory of the cave. Imagine an underground chamber like a cave with a long entrance open to the daylight and as wide as the cave. In this chamber there are people who have been prisoners there since they were children. Their legs and necks are so fastened that they can only look straight ahead of them and cannot turn their heads. Some way off behind and higher up, a fire is burning, and between the fire and the prisoners runs a road in front of which a curtain wall has been built, like the screen at a puppet show, between the operators and their audience, above which they show their puppets. So now, here we are. This is the picture we have to start, and you are actually going to be one of the people in the cave. So we can guess immediately where Plato is going. There's three pieces to this part of it. The first, the people in the cave, refers to the mass of people, the majority, the people in society, the ordinary people, you, me, and all of the people who are just living their lives. And they have been there since childhood, so the only reality they have is this reality, the reality of the cave they're in. And the next piece, so they're born and that's their experience. Now we can just jump forward to Martin Heidegger and something that he identifies which relates back to the Platonic. Now he doesn't reference Plato in this piece, but essentially Heidegger, who was one of the great philosophers of the 20th century and stained his whole life by becoming a Nazi and was unrepentant somewhat for that. But before he became a Nazi, he wrote one of the most important books, philosophical books in the 20th century, which is called Being and Time. And Heidegger was very concerned with the idea of existence. How do we exist? What it's about. And one of his concepts is that of thrownness. This idea, he called it thrownness. And it's the idea that we find ourselves in the world. What does that mean? That we find ourselves in the world, if you think about it. I think I find myself in the world at a particular time, in a particular society, in a particular family, and in a particular culture. So you and I, wherever you are reading this or listening to this, you have found yourself in this world. Now there are people who say, no, we chose our parents or whatever. And I understand that there are people who think, no, we didn't find ourselves in this world. We chose to be in this world at this point in time. I'm not fully gone on that idea. So for here anyway, in terms of our discussion of awareness, we're going to use Heidegger's concept of thrownness. So we have found ourselves in the world. So now when we go back to Plato, we say we're in this cave. It's this cave, it's not some other cave. And it's these images on the wall, not some other images. The next piece that Plato is, so now we've got that we're in the cave, we're part of the society. Secondly, we are finding ourselves there. There are other caves, but the one we found ourselves. And the third one is the metaphor of the chain or the shackles which keep you bound. Now in philosophy, you will find this metaphor of the shackle or the chain in other writers. And very famously, you will find it in the most romantic of all philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now Rousseau was a philosopher who had an enormous influence on the world of philosophy, but also on modern thinking in education and psychotherapy and all of these areas, because Rousseau had a very optimistic view of human nature, and one of his famous phrases was, "Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains." So here we have the metaphor of the chain again. Being in chains, being born free, but being in chains. Another immensely influential philosopher is that of Karl Marx. People consider Karl Marx oftentimes as a political commentator or even economics. I mean, that he had huge influence on this, and he did. An enormous influence on the world. Karl Marx's work has had an enormous influence and is the father of communism, and we all know where that went to. But in the Communist Manifesto, Marx talks about the fact that, when the proletariat, when the working class, when they revolt, when they kick off the shackles of the capitalist bourgeoisie, all they have to lose is their chains. So again, this concept of the chain. So we've got Rousseau and Marx and we've got Plato all talking about this thing about being enchained or being shackled. So that's a kind of enslavement. So already now in Plato, in the first paragraph of the allegory of the cave, we've got three concepts about ourselves as human beings in the world. We find ourselves in a world that not of our choosing, and we are enslaved by that. Now he moves on. Imagine further that there are people carrying all sorts of gear along behind the curtain wall, projecting above it and including figures of men and animals made of wood and stone and all sorts of other materials, and that some of these people, as you would expect, are talking and some are not. Do you think our prisoners could see anything of themselves or their fellows except the shadows thrown by the fire on the wall of the cave opposite them? If they were able to talk to each other, would they not assume that the shadows that they saw were the real things? And so in every way, wouldn't they believe that the shadows of the objects we mentioned were the whole truth? So here we have Plato taking it a bit further now, because he's talking about the shadows on the wall. What is creating your reality? What is creating your experiences? What are you seeing? So he's talking about the fact that there are people who are choosing what to expose you to. The prisoners are being given images and sounds, and those become their only experiences of reality. And this means that these experiences of reality are controlled by others. And the implication here is that most people don't know anything other than what they've been exposed to, and this is controlled by other people. And he's also introducing here a very important idea about the prisoners talking to each other. He's saying basically that if the prisoners could speak to each other, would they not both agree with each other that this is reality, that what they're seeing is the truth? So because, and this is the idea of conformity and groupthink. So now we have the group piece coming in, which is that not only are we experiencing these realities, but the other people alongside us are also experiencing this. And so as we communicate to each other, we confirm with each other, we verify with each other that this is reality and this is the truth. So we're now brought into a situation where those people in control, who's in control, are producing what we see as truth. Let's go back up to the 20th century, and let's go back up to the work of Michel Foucault, who's largely the main part of his work was this idea that he discovered this relationship between knowledge and power. So knowledge is produced by the people in power. So the knowledge of the people in the cave is produced by the puppeteers. And Foucault built most of his life work on this, showing in so many different aspects that this principle of knowledge and power. I would not take my own thinking as far as Foucault does in relation to that, but it's a very important insight. Also echoed by Karl Marx. Again, Marx suggested when he wrote famously, the ruling ideas of the age are ever the ideas of the ruling class. So the people in power, the ruling class, are the people who produce the ideas, and we are in the cave, and this is our experience of reality. So we are being given a picture of what's true, and because we have no other experience, that's what we believe. Now the first step towards awareness is an understanding of that principle, that we must understand if we want to become more aware, more self-aware of those influences and how much of that we have actually picked up along the way. Is there an aspect of ourselves that can question that? And this is where Plato goes to now. So having set the scene thus far, Plato turns to the revolutionary idea of what will happen when a person escapes from the cave. So this part of the story contains a series of progressive steps, each having a particular effect on the individual as they try to escape from the cave. And this part of the allegory helps to understand and bring into the picture the idea that there are some risks involved in leaving the cave, which means risks involved in awareness. And that may be why a lot of people don't like it or don't want it. Think what would naturally happen to them if they were released from their bonds and cured of their delusions. Suppose one of them were let loose and suddenly compelled to stand up and turn his head and look and walk toward the fire. All these actions would be painful, and he would be too dazzled to see properly the objects of which he used to see as the shadows. What do you think he would say if what he was told that what he used to see was just so much nonsense, and that now he was nearer reality and seeing more correctly? Okay, so now we have an idea here that Plato brings in, which is now he uses the word compelled here, which is interesting because it suggests that this person was compelled to stand up and look toward the fire, that somehow he managed to break the chains, but something compelled him to do it. So you have to ask yourself the question, maybe that's how we develop awareness, that we become compelled. Some experiences we have in our lives are telling us it's really time to question this. Maybe we find that we're at odds with ourselves in some way, or that there's just too much pain, or our life just feels really wrong, and it compels us to say, I'm going to look at this differently, I'm going to step away. So I think that that may be part of what he is trying to say, that human beings are creatures for whom familiarity is very sort of seductive. That it's difficult. You have to have a good reason to get to awareness. So in any case, he's reassuring us that two things will happen if we stand up and turn away from our current reality. It will hurt, and we will be confused. So he also brings the three different elements of the transition. The turning, the looking, and the walking. Turning means the willingness to turn away from something you're in and turn towards something else. Looking is the openness to learn, openness to see. And that openness, that's a visual thing in the allegory. But there can also be an openness, a kind of an internal vision, which is your imagination, allowing yourself to see things in the faculty of your imagination. And walking. Walking is action, it's movement, it's behavior, changing the behavior. So each of these are important to the picture of awareness that we're talking about. Being willing to turn away from something that's familiar, be opening to new ideas, and changing behavior. And many times, we think about, people will say, well, I don't want to think about that right now because it's too painful. And the other thing is, you hear people say, there are none so blind that those who will not see, refusing to look. So to summarize, the first steps of awareness require courage to turn around, to look at things differently, and to walk towards these new experiences. And this will lead to a certain amount of pain and a certain amount of confusion. So now Plato takes us another step along the way towards the change that needs to happen for to leave the cave. He says, and if on top of that he were compelled to say what each of the passing objects was when it was pointed out to him, don't you think he would be at a loss and think that what he used to see was far truer than the object now being pointed out to him? And if he were made to look directly at the light of the fire, it would hurt his eyes, and he would turn back and retreat to the things which he could see properly, which he would think really clearer than the things being shown him. So here we have the notion of the consolation that goes with retreating from the challenge. Awareness brings challenge. Awareness opens your mind to things, but it can be difficult. So I think that at this point, Plato is saying that now we're in a situation where this could require courage, and you're going to be confronted with difficulties. So we look at the next piece and we think about, there's another piece in this, which is the notion of the image versus the reality. So here's the prisoner is looking at the difference between what's real and what's not real. And if we want to look at more modern philosophers thinking about this in the modern world, we can go to a French sociologist called Jean Baudrillard, who makes a strong case for the fact with the development of media today, that actually the image is everything. So Plato is saying this, the difference between the image, which you see cast on the shadows on the wall, and the object that creates the image. Well, in the modern world, Jean Baudrillard is talking that actually nearly everything we have now, it seems to be an image or a copy of something. There's very little authenticity left. Everything is turned into what he calls the hyper-real. He gives an example of this when he talks about the Iraq War, first Iraq War, and the way the media present it. And there's no real sense in that there's an actual war going on. What you see in the media was you saw the Scuds and you saw the Patriot missiles, and you had this constant repetition of this, the Patriot taking down the Scud. The pilots who were involved in the bombing were almost like using a computer game. They were remote and they were using computers to fly missiles over things, and it all looked like just Call of Duty or some of these simulation games. So Baudrillard actually basically rather controversially said, the Iraq war didn't happen. What he meant by that is that for most human beings who were looking at this, it made no difference. It seemed like a film. The horror of the actual war, the visceral reality of what warfare is, was completely sanitized from the audience who were looking on. There's several other examples you can use, and there's a wonderful lecturer called Rick Roderick, and he passed away too early, and I love his lectures on the Self Under Siege. And I will put a link to that. You'll have a link to that. In fact, everything you get here, you're going to get the handbook, and all the links will be in the handbook for the course. Well, you'll have had it actually anyway if you're downloading it. But he describes Busch Gardens, the theme park. And he says, if you go to Busch Gardens, they have each culture represented by a different world. You've got in the same way as Disney has Frontierland and all the different lands, Well, Busch Garden has, you can go to Switzerland. And when you go to Switzerland, you don't ever have to go to Switzerland ever again because you've been to Switzerland. The image of Switzerland, all the Switzerland things, all the Swiss stuff is there. And so here's the image. The reality is different. But you can save yourself the travel and, as he calls it, the bug bites and all the rest of that by going to these places. You can save yourself all of that by going to the image of it. And he tells the story that as a child, he loved dinosaurs. But after Jurassic Park, he would actually probably be disappointed now if he met a real dinosaur. And Baudrillard calls this, hyper-real. Everything is intensified. And so in terms of awareness, this means having the challenge to think about what are you seeing, what are you experiencing, to what extent is that real, to what reality is behind the image that you're looking at, behind the film you're watching, behind the story, behind the social media presentation, behind the Twitter feed. What's the reality behind that? Two of the great dystopian novels of the 20th century are Brave New World in 1984, and they're quite different. But Huxley's Brave New World is about this. It's about actually creating a world where the human being is turned into basically a robot. A human, fully fleshed, robotic, but a happy robot. And this is achieved through drugs, through genetic modification, and through behavior modification, the use of learning theory and psychology, the Skinnerian behavioral approach. But Huxley work's extraordinary. He wrote it in 1933, and it's amazing to think that nearly 100 years later, what we were experiencing. And I remember when I was reading it first, which is 40 years ago, I remember being fascinated by the idea that you didn't go to the movies, you went to the feelies. The feelies are three-dimensional. The feelies are, and then I'm thinking about Mark Zuckerberg and his new plan to turn to bring Facebook to a new level, where you will actually meet people on Facebook, and instead of being a two-dimensional screen, you'll have a VR helmet, and you will meet the person in 3 dimensions. So you will see the high definition of the wrinkles on their faces, and if they got a new pimple, and the way they smile, and so you'll have the completely immersed experience of meeting this person, but you'll be meeting them in a virtual reality, and that's not real. So the image from the reality, and the image will be even better than the reality. So this is extraordinary that we're there. So Plato has marked this for us 2,000 years ago, saying, look at the difference between what's real and what's the image. So awareness is about being sensitive to that, sensitizing your thinking and your perception to help you to see the difference. Now he takes us to the next level, and he says, what's going to happen with this newfound freedom when the prisoner is getting further away and moving towards the light to escape? He says, when he thought of his first home and what passed for wisdom there, and of his fellow prisoners, don't you think he would congratulate himself on his good fortune and be sorry for them. What would happen if he went back to sit in his old seat in the cave? Wouldn't his eyes be blinded by the darkness because he had suddenly come in from the sunlight? And if he had to discriminate between the shadows in competition with the other prisoners while he was still blinded, a process that would take some time, wouldn't he be likely to make a fool of himself? And they would say that his visit to the upper world had ruined his sight, and that the ascent was not worth even attempting. And if anybody tried to release them and lead him up, they would kill him if they could lay their hands on him. Now, this part of the allegory is telling us something about the effect that the changes would happen, the effect they'd have on your relationships with other people. Because there's a sense that the prisoner, once he has the deeper understanding and he has more enlightenment and a comprehension vision of the world, will develop an immediate awareness of how trapped the other people are in the cave, and would have a sensitivity and wish to actually share this experience with them and help them to find life in the upper world and in the different reality. But however, if he goes back into the cave, the changes that have happened for him, because he was confused, eventually he came out into the light and his eyes adjusted to the light. But if he goes back into the cave, he will get confused again because his vision will not be right. And when he goes back and tries to explain to people, they'll say, you've been ruined by this experience. You should have stayed in the cave, and now don't be bothering us with this new information. So this is very difficult for the person, and Plato is pessimistic about people because he saw what happened to Socrates. So he has the sense that if you try and engage with other people to show them a new way, then they may reject you or they may persecute you. So we will be looking at this in terms of ideology further on in the course. That what happens on social media, for example, if you present a view on social media that's not part of the common herd, then you can suffer great anger and vilification and abuse. You may even be cancelled, and there's a lot of that going on in the world at the moment. I mean, back in the day before all the social media, the classic sort of trope was, young person goes off to college and has their head turned and learns things that they never knew before and had an understanding of things in a way they never saw before, and went off and went back to home and unfortunately couldn't fit anymore, didn't fit in that reality anymore, and sometimes had lots of conflict and rejection. So we're in a situation, so we could say that the message that we can take now from Plato in relation to awareness is that a great deal of what we believe about the world is a result of finding ourselves at a particular time in history. So this is part of what your homework will be. I will be suggesting homework here. Think about the culture that you've come from. What are the, where do you find yourself? What have you found yourself in? Why is this a reality versus some other reality? Is it a better reality or worse reality? How do you measure that? The way our lives are shaped by these experiences is a product of the influences of powerful forces, including authority figures, and who set about shaping how you see yourself in the world and the rules for how to live. I was born in the 50s and I grew up in Ireland. So if you're watching this from somewhere else, I just want to say Céad Míle Fáilte, which is a nice Irish greeting for you. 100,000 welcomes to the course. But one of the really powerful sources at that time was the Catholic Church. So much so that if the government had to pass a bill or make some new rule or add something to how our society should be or could be developed, they would check in with the church. They'd have to ring the archbishop or the cardinal, actually. I think the main one at that time was John McQuaid in Dublin. They would call him over to government buildings and he would come over, or they would go to the bishop's castle or whatever they called it, and he would either give his imprimatur or not. And if he didn't give his imprimatur, it was going to be very difficult to pass any of the bills because the populace were so driven by obedience to the Catholic Church. So our ethos for how we should run our lives. So we had huge families, there's no contraception. And even bills that were trying to help with any of that ran aground and people lost their jobs. Very famous mother and baby, mother and child scheme created havoc. So Plato is identifying this. We will talk a lot more about this later on, further down the line. But for now, Plato's identifying that our beliefs have been largely influenced by the ethics and beliefs given to us by those in power. So understanding these and changing our way may lead to confusion and distress. So you've got to allow yourself to be a bit confused. And the other part of that is that sometimes your relationships are going to suffer. If you move towards your awareness and opening awareness, you may lose relationships. People may find that it's too difficult. They will reject you. And as a result of that, you may have to find new people to talk to, make new friends. But that's very, very difficult because we want to be accepted. We want to feel that we belong. And so one of the things we're going to be looking at is belonging and what it means and how much we can sacrifice ourselves in order to belong to people. It's daunting to think about changing. And a lot of this course is going to bring you into areas where you may find that you will be challenged. And that's why maybe it needs to have some trigger warnings, because one of the things that's happening in a lot of education at the moment is a feeling that we shouldn't be troubled by education. We shouldn't be troubled by learning. And this has infiltrated the universities hugely, which is that, we've got safe spaces, trigger warnings. The idea being that emotionally, you should never be discomforted. And of course, this is a disaster in terms of human learning. I mean, absolute disaster. Because if we say that the process of learning doesn't hurt, then all you'll ever learn is something that you could be comfortable with. And that takes you right back to the cave, where you will sit complacently, consenting and obeying and conforming to the world that has been given to you by somebody else. So my challenge to you, we will be going forward in the next one that we do here. I will be looking at, what tools do you need? What are you going to need if you're on this journey? Because essentially when the prisoner leaves the cave, he sees the sun and realizes the source of light is from the sun. It's not from the fire in the cave. And even though he's blinded and confused by that initially, he's able to make those distinctions between what is the shadow, what is real, what is not real. And if we take the word to describe that experience, it's enlightenment. And there's the Western concept of enlightenment and there's an Eastern concept of enlightenment. I'm staying with the Western tradition here in our philosophy, Western philosophy, which is that the period of enlightenment is opening up the world to our reason, to learning, to truth, to discovery, to curiosity, and to falsification. The idea that we can actually find evidence that will disabuse of certain beliefs that we have. So it's a journey. I know that word is bandied around all of the time, but in this situation, it is genuinely a movement towards continued learning. It's an existential choice that you've gotten yourself into here if you want to continue on. It'll bring you joy, confusion, pain, and it's lifelong because you never stop. And that's the beautiful thing about it. The thing that excites me most about learning is that you never get to the end of it. So our next session, we're going to look at the tools you're going to need for the adventure. And we will do that. We will go a little bit more towards psychology in the next section. And we will find that there are certain things that you need to pack your bag, as they say, certain tools that you may need that'll help you along the way. So until we talk then, take care of yourself.